Welcome to Silent Crime Case. Today's episode takes us to Fairhaven, Washington, where a story of betrayal, obsession, and murder unfolded in a quiet coastal town. The events we are about to explore may seem like fiction, but tragically they are all too real. The murder of Louis Anderson, a beloved family man, left a lasting scar on his community, as those closest to him harbored secrets that would ultimately lead to his death. Join us as we unravel the chilling details of this case and discover how obsession can blur the lines between fantasy and reality, with deadly consequences. Fairhaven, Washington, is a picturesque coastal town known for its friendly neighbors and breathtaking views. It is where people leave their doors unlocked and everyone looks out for each other. But on April 12, 2005, the peace was shattered when Louis Anderson, a 45-year-old engineer, was found brutally murdered in his own home. What began as a routine morning for his family became a nightmare that would haunt them forever. The police were called to the Anderson home after Louis's 16-year-old daughter, Emma, discovered her father lying in a pool of blood. The scene was chaotic: furniture overturned, books and personal items scattered across the floor. At first glance, it appeared to be a robbery gone wrong, but as detectives would soon discover, this was no ordinary crime. Valuable items had been left untouched, and there were no signs of forced entry. The investigation quickly turned inward, focusing on the people closest to Louis. Over the next few weeks, what unfolded would reveal a twisted tale of love, obsession, and betrayal. Those closest to Louis, his wife Allison, and his best friend Jacob Palmer became central figures in the investigation. As detectives uncovered hidden relationships and dark secrets, the true motive behind the murder came to light. This was not a random act of violence, but a carefully orchestrated plan, driven by Jacob. Worked with Louis at the same tech firm, and the two men shared a deep bond over their love of technology and innovation. But as the investigation would later reveal, Jacob's role in Louis's life went far beyond friendship. On the morning of April 12, 2005, Emma Anderson awoke to find the house unusually quiet. Her father, who was usually up early preparing for the day, was nowhere to be found. As she made her way downstairs, she noticed the living room was in disarray. Chairs were overturned, books lay scattered across the floor, and the television was still on. In the middle of the chaos lay her father, Louis Anderson, motionless and surrounded by a pool of blood. Emma's scream pierced the silence, and her mother, Allison, rushed downstairs to find her daughter standing over Louis's body. Allison immediately called 911, her hands shaking as she spoke to the operator. The words seemed to escape her in slow motion. Her husband was dead, and it looked like someone had broken into their home. Within minutes, the police arrived at the scene. Officers secured the area and began their investigation. At first glance, the scene appeared to be a robbery gone wrong. The living room was ransacked, with items strewn across the floor. But as detectives Laura Hayes and Victor Cruz began to examine the scene more closely, they noticed several inconsistencies. Valuable items like the family's television, jewelry, and electronics were left untouched. There were no signs of forced entry, and the front door was still locked. Near Louis's body, a brass statue lay covered in blood. It was clear that this was the murder weapon, and the detectives knew they were dealing with something far more personal than a random break-in. The focus of the investigation quickly shifted from the idea of a robbery to those who had access to the home, those closest to Louis. Detectives Hayes and Cruz immediately began their investigation, interviewing Allison and Emma to gather as much information as possible. Allison, who appeared distraught, explained that she had been asleep upstairs when the murder occurred. She said she hadn't heard anything unusual until Emma's scream woke her up. Her story seemed plausible, but the detectives couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Emma, on the other hand, was visibly shaken by the discovery of her father's body. Through tears, she recounted finding him in the living room, his body cold and lifeless. She explained that she had gone downstairs to find him preparing for their planned hike, only to stumble upon the horrifying scene. Emma's emotional state made it clear that she had no involvement in the crime, but the detectives noticed a subtle tension between her and her mother. It was as if there was something left unsaid, a fracture in their relationship that seemed to go beyond the trauma of the moment. As the detectives combed through the house, they found no signs of forced entry. The doors were locked and the windows were intact, leading them to believe that the killer had either been let in or already had access to the house. This raised immediate suspicions about the people closest to Louis, his wife, Allison, and his best friend, Jacob Palmer. Detective Cruz began looking into Louis's personal life, starting with his colleagues at the tech firm where he worked. By all accounts, Louis was well-liked and respected. He had no known enemies, and his co-workers were shocked by the news of his death. But when Cruz spoke with Jacob Palmer, something felt off. Jacob seemed overly emotional, far more distraught than anyone else Cruz had spoken to. While it wasn't unusual for a best friend to be devastated by such a loss, Jacob's behavior raised questions. Jacob admitted that he had been close to both Lewis and Allison, often spending time at their home. He described his relationship with Allison as purely platonic, though he hesitated when asked if he had ever developed romantic feelings for her. Jacob's reluctance to answer the question directly made the detectives suspicious, and they decided to dig deeper into his relationship with the Anderson family. Meanwhile, Detective Hayes focused her attention on Allison. She interviewed several of Allison's friends and family members, all of whom expressed concern about her recent behavior. Allison had become increasingly withdrawn, consumed by her writing to the point where she seemed to be living more in her fictional world than in reality. Her latest novel, a dark, twisted story about a woman trapped in a loveless marriage, had become an obsession. Friends noticed that Allison had begun to blur the lines between fiction and reality, and some even wondered if her mental state had deteriorated. The detectives knew they were dealing with more than just a simple robbery. The evidence pointed to a crime of passion, driven by deep emotional turmoil, and possibly even a conspiracy between Allison and Jacob. But they needed more concrete evidence to build their case. Allison Anderson was brought in for further questioning the next day. The detectives knew that her behavior had raised red flags, but they still needed more information to determine if she was directly involved in her husband's death. Sitting across from Detective Hayes, Allison seemed nervous, fidgeting with her hands as she spoke. Her voice trembled slightly as she explained that she had been asleep during the murder and had no knowledge of what had happened until Emma found Lewis. Hayes pressed her on the state of her marriage. Allison hesitated before admitting that she and Lewis had grown apart in recent years. She described him as distant and preoccupied with work, while she had become more focused on her writing. But when asked if she had any reason to want her husband dead, Allison's demeanor shifted. She became defensive, insisting that she loved Lewis and would never harm him. Yet her evasive answers left the detectives unconvinced. They turned their attention to her writing. Allison had been working on a novel about a woman who murders her husband in a fit of rage, and the parallels to her own life were hard to ignore. Hayes asked if her writing had influenced her actions in any way, but Allison denied any connection between her fictional world and reality. She claimed that her novel was just a story, nothing more. But the detectives weren't so sure. As the interrogation continued, Allison's behavior became more erratic. She avoided eye contact, her responses grew shorter, and she seemed increasingly uncomfortable with the line of questioning. Detective Hayes knew that Allison was hiding something, but without concrete evidence there was little they could do to hold her. Jacob Palmer, however, was another matter entirely. Detective Cruz brought him in for questioning the same day. Jacob appeared anxious from the moment he entered the room, his hands shaking as he answered the detective's questions. He admitted that he had been at home the night of the murder, working on a project for work, but he had no one to corroborate his alibi. When Cruz pressed him on his relationship with Allison, Jacob hesitated again. After a long pause, he finally confessed that he had developed feelings for her, though he insisted he had never acted on them. He claimed that he had always been loyal to Lewis and had tried to support Allison during her struggles with her writing and mental health. But the detectives weren't convinced. Jacob's evasiveness and emotional responses suggested that there was more to the story than he was letting on. As the detectives continued to gather information from the interrogations, the forensic team made a crucial breakthrough. The brass statue used to kill Lewis Anderson had been sent to the lab for analysis, and the results were in. Partial fingerprints were found on the murder weapon, fingerprints that didn't belong to Lewis or Allison. Instead, they matched Jacob Palmer. This discovery changed the course of the investigation. The fact that Jacob's fingerprints were found on the murder weapon placed him at the scene of the crime and directly linked him to Lewis's death. The detectives immediately brought Jacob back in for questioning. Faced with the evidence, Jacob's demeanor shifted. He became more defensive, insisting that he had been to the Anderson home many times and could have touched the statue on any of those occasions. But Detective Cruz wasn't buying it. He pressed Jacob on the inconsistencies in his story, and under the weight of the interrogation, Jacob began to crack. He admitted that he had been at the Anderson home the night of the murder, but he maintained that he had nothing to do with Lewis's death. He claimed that he had gone there to talk to Allison, who had been struggling with her mental health and her writing. Jacob insisted that he had left the house before anything happened, but the detectives knew that his story didn't add up. Meanwhile, Detective Hayes was digging deeper into Allison's phone records and emails. She uncovered a series of messages between Allison and Jacob that painted a disturbing picture. Over the past year, the two had grown increasingly close, with their conversations shifting from friendly support to something far more intimate. In several of the messages, Allison expressed frustration with her marriage, describing Lewis as emotionally distant and unsupportive. But it was a series of texts exchanged just days before the murder that raised the most suspicion. In one message, Allison wrote to Jacob, "I don't know how much more of this I can take. Sometimes I think the only way out is to end it." Jacob's response was chilling. "If that's what you think needs to happen, I'm here for you." The messages made it clear that Jacob had been complicit in Allison's plan to kill her husband. He hadn't just been a passive observer, he had actively encouraged her to go through with it. The detectives now had enough evidence to arrest both Allison and Jacob for their roles in Lewis's murder. As the investigation progressed, the detectives began to piece together the full story of Allison and Jacob's relationship. What had started as a close friendship between Lewis's best friend and his wife had evolved into something far more dangerous. Jacob had always been drawn to Allison, but he had kept his feelings hidden out of respect for Lewis. However, as Allison's marriage deteriorated, she began to lean on Jacob more and more for emotional support. At first, their relationship was innocent late-night conversations about life, work, and Allison's struggles with her writing. But as Allison's mental state worsened, she began to confide in Jacob about her growing dissatisfaction with her marriage. She described Lewis as emotionally unavailable, distant, and unsupportive of her creative pursuits. Jacob, who had always harbored feelings for her, saw an opportunity to get closer. Their relationship soon crossed the line from emotional support to something far more dangerous. Allison's obsession with her novel, a dark story about a woman who murders her husband, began to bleed into her real life. She started to talk about her own life in terms of her characters, and Jacob, instead of steering her away from these thoughts, fed into her delusions. Jacob's feelings for Allison clouded his judgment. He began to believe that the only way for them to be together was for Lewis to be out of the picture. But instead of discouraging Allison's dark fantasies, he encouraged them. In the weeks leading up to the murder, their conversations became more explicit, with Jacob suggesting ways that Allison could end her suffering. The detectives uncovered a chilling email exchange between the two just days before Lewis's death. In one email, Allison wrote, "I keep thinking about how easy it would be. One moment, and it's all over. No more pretending, no more feeling trapped." Jacob's response was cold and calculated. "If that's what you want, I'll help you. We'll make sure it looks like an accident." It became clear that Jacob had been more than just a passive participant in the plot to kill Lewis. He had actively helped Allison plan the murder, providing her with emotional support and logistical advice on how to carry out the crime. The detectives now had the evidence they needed to make an arrest. Faced with the overwhelming evidence against them, both Allison and Jacob were brought back in for questioning. This time, there was no escaping the truth. The detectives laid out the forensic evidence, the fingerprints on the murder weapon, and the incriminating messages exchanged between the two. Allison was the first to crack. She broke down in tears during the interrogation, confessing to the murder of her husband. She explained how her obsession with her novel had spiraled out of control, blurring the lines between fiction and reality. She admitted that she had felt trapped in her marriage and saw no way out other than to kill Lewis. She described how she had confided in Jacob, who had encouraged her to go through with it. In her confession, Allison revealed the details of the night of the murder. She had waited until Lewis had fallen asleep on the couch in the living room before retrieving the brass statue from the mantel. With Jacob's help, she had planned to stage the scene to look like a robbery gone wrong. But when the time came to carry out the act, she hesitated. It was Jacob who had urged her to follow through, telling her that it was the only way they could be free. With trembling hands, Allison picked up the statue and struck Lewis in the head. She described the moment of impact, how the room seemed to spin as she realized what she had done. She hit him again, just as Jacob had instructed, to make sure he was dead. Then, she began to ransack the room, overturning furniture and scattering items to make it look like a break-in. Jacob's role in the crime became clear as Allison continued her confession. He had been there the entire time, coaching her through the murder and helping her cover her tracks. After Lewis was dead, Jacob left the house, instructing Allison to call 911 and report the crime as a robbery. They thought they had gotten away with it. But the forensic evidence and their incriminating messages were too strong to ignore. Jacob was arrested shortly after Allison's confession. During his own interrogation, he tried to downplay his role in the crime, insisting that he had only been trying to help Allison through a difficult time. But the detective saw through his lies. He had been an active participant in the murder, motivated by his obsession with Allison and his desire to eliminate Lewis from their lives. The trial of Allison Anderson and Jacob Palmer began in the fall of 2005. It was one of the most high-profile cases the small town of Fairhaven had ever seen, drawing national attention due to the shocking nature of the crime. The courtroom was packed with spectators, reporters, and members of the Anderson family, all eager to see justice served. The prosecution presented a strong case against both Allison and Jacob, using the forensic evidence, their confessions, and the incriminating messages exchanged between them. The prosecutor argued that this was a premeditated murder, driven by Allison's delusions and Jacob's obsessive desire to be with her. The jury listened intently as the prosecution laid out the sequence of events that led to Lewis Anderson's death, painting a picture of a cold, calculated plot to kill an innocent man. Allison's defense attorney attempted to argue that she had been suffering from a mental breakdown at the time of the murder, unable to distinguish between her fictional world and reality. They claimed that she had been manipulated by Jacob, who had taken advantage of her fragile state. But the jury was unconvinced. The evidence was clear. Allison had known exactly what she was doing when she picked up that brass statue and struck her husband. Jacob's defense was equally weak. His attorney argued that he had been a passive participant, caught up in Allison's delusions, but never actively involved in the murder. But the messages between him and Allison told a different story. He had encouraged her, coached her, and helped her plan the crime. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for only 2 days before returning with their verdict. Allison Anderson was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Jacob Palmer was found guilty of being an accessory to murder and received a 25-year sentence. The courtroom was silent as the verdicts were read. Members of Lewis's family wept quietly in the back, relieved that justice had been served, but heartbroken by the loss of their beloved son, brother, and father. The murder of Lewis Anderson and the subsequent trial of his wife and best friend left a deep scar on the community of Fairhaven. The town had always prided itself on being a safe, tight-knit place where neighbors looked out for one another. But the shocking nature of the crime shattered that sense of security. In the weeks following the trial, friends and neighbors gathered to support the Anderson children, Emma and Brandon, who had lost both their parents in the span of a few months. Emma, who had been the one to discover her father's body, struggled with the trauma of that day, while Brandon grappled with the betrayal of his mother. The community rallied around them, offering support, meals, and comfort as they tried to rebuild their lives. A memorial service was held for Lewis Anderson, attended by hundreds of people who had known him as a kind, gentle man with a brilliant mind and a loving heart. His colleagues from the tech firm where he had worked spoke about his passion for innovation and his dedication to his family. His friends remembered him as someone who always had time to lend a hand or share a laugh. But the shadow of his murder loomed large over the service, a reminder of the darkness that had claimed his life. The case also sparked conversations about mental health and the dangers of obsession. Many in the community couldn't understand how Allison had become so consumed by her fictional world that she was willing to kill her husband. Mental health professionals were brought in to speak to local schools and organizations about the importance of recognizing the signs of mental illness and seeking help before it's too late. As the years passed, Fairhaven slowly began to heal, but the memory of the Anderson case remained. It became a cautionary tale, a story that parents told their children about the dangers of letting fantasy bleed into reality. The town would never forget Lewis Anderson, nor the betrayal that led to his tragic death. The case of Lewis Anderson's murder serves as a chilling reminder of how obsession can twist even the most ordinary lives into something deadly. As we reflect on the events that unfolded in Fairhaven, we are left with questions. Could this tragedy have been prevented? What drives someone to take the life of the person they once loved? We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think could have been done differently, if anything? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow Silent Crime Case for more in-depth stories of true crime and the shocking truths behind them.